All right. I'm here with Dr. Yvonne Skipper, who is the author of an article in the Action Research Journal titled Knowledge Mobilization, Stepping into Interdependent and Relational Space Using Co-Creation. You say in the article that action research typically starts with the question, how can we improve the situation? And then co-create knowledge with people, which is absolutely the ideal, and that this approach contrasts with conventional approaches in which academics create knowledge and then disseminate it to users via conferences, reports, etc. But then you really land in this article on that the co-creative approach involves a shift in academics' thinking and approaches, and that the success of co-creation depends on the shifting from being self-focused and independent to being other-focused and interdependent. Then you really, in the article, you really unpack that through a couple of really concrete examples of work that you've done. It's just fascinating. I mean, the first time I read the very first draft, I was just riveted. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into some discussion about the article.
Sure, thank you. So I'm a senior lecturer based in the School of Education at Glasgow University, but I'm a psychologist, so I consider myself sitting right between the two fields of education and psychology. And most of my research is quite applied, so what I'm most interested in is how we can take all this knowledge that we have in the academy and work with practice partners to create interventions and projects that are out and making a positive impact in the world. So a lot of the things I do are around raising aspiration and motivation in children and young people, so helping them to believe they can achieve, and just to get kids and young people thinking about where they can go to, where they are now, and how they can improve and get better on their learning journey. So for me, the really powerful part of the work I do is that real between, I think my co-author Deborah Pepler says, between practice and academia, when those two things meet and people are working, that's where sparks fly. And that's something I really resonate with. When we can get practice partners and academics working together, we can create projects that have a really positive impact.
That's great, thanks. So maybe getting a little bit into the paper, how did you, tell us your journey of how you got interested in this topic of co-creation of knowledge. On the one hand, that phrase can sound really highfalutin, and really abstract. How did you get interested in it, and why is it so important to you?
It's something that I got interested in through my work with Deborah Pepler. So she and I met at a conference years ago, and I really enjoyed meeting her. And then there was this funding available for junior researchers to go and work with senior academics. And so if anybody's a junior researcher here, if you ever think about these things and you're worried about emailing someone and asking them a kind of punting email, can I come and work with you? Just send the email. That's exactly what I did. And I was able to go to Canada and do some work with Deb, and she and I built quite a strong relationship now. So we're really practicing what we preach in terms of that relational approach. And through a lot of our discussions, we talked about these projects that we were doing where we were working in the community, where we had partners that we were working with. So for example, Deb's work with Breaking the Cycle, which is a project for substance using women and their children, and the work I was doing at Stoke Reeds with my partners, Janet Cooper and other people in Stoke Reeds. And we were interested in how we work with these partners to create projects, and why sometimes these projects just run and flow and everything works, and sometimes they really don't. So, what is it that causes some to fly and some not? It's not just the money. Obviously, the money's part of it. Can you get the funding to keep you going? But what is it that means that some of these projects work and which ones don't? So we were talking about what we could do to try and understand that a little bit more in terms of, helping them, but also looking at not just the individuals, but what the universities are doing in terms of how they create spaces for this to happen. So that was where these conversations started. And then it was as I was reading some papers and I came across the kind of self-construal theory which runs through the paper, and I thought, actually, when you read something and you go, this is kind of what I've been thinking, but I haven't had the words for it or the framework. And when I saw that, I thought, this is what's happening, is that a lot of the time in academia, so just very briefly, the theory suggests that we have an independent self and an interdependent self. And the independent self values influencing other people, getting people to think like what we think, moving towards our goals. whereas the interdependent self is more interested in how we can be embedded within the social environments in which we find ourselves. So it's very relational, it's looking at other people's goals, it's looking at fitting in. And in academia, we're really often judged on this, independent self. So we need to be the lead author on the paper. We need to convince people that our theory is the right one. We need to get people on our side. Whereas to really do effective co-creative work, we need to really use this interdependent self and focus on the other and the other's needs and how we can fit together. And so when we started thinking about it that way, it gave us kind of a framework to really understand it. And that's why we wanted to explore that in this paper.
Yeah, self-construal is really important in the paper, and your background in psychology, I'm beginning to actually tie it together a little bit more than just from a distant, associate editor role, and how that plays in. But I'm really interested in this, and it really resonated with me personally, right, when I read it. So I'd never heard self-construal theory before. But it was like, I had these ahas. It's like, Jesus, that's happening inside of me. That someone just named something that I never could name before, even though I felt it in my bones. And I just wonder, this is maybe a weird question, but I mean, why you mentioned sort of some about academics. You mentioned the way we're trained. But I wanted to just unpack that a little bit more. Why I do think true, as you call it in the paper, as you articulate and explain in the paper, interdependence, some kind of real interdependence. I think it's really hard for academics. And I just wonder if you could unpack a little bit more about, one, do you think it is really in some way specifically hard for academics, or is it just hard for everybody in the entire world? And if so, what is it about academics and that makes it, harder maybe than other folks?
Yeah, I think there's a few things happening there. So first of all, although we all have both of these selves inside of us, and we do use one or the other depending on the setting. So maybe when you're at work, you're using your independent self, you're managing others, you're getting them to follow your lead. But when you're at home, you're using your interdependent self with your family and engaging with their needs. So we do have both, but there is some suggestion in the theory that we have one that we prefer to use naturally. And so you tend to find that men and white people and people from higher SES groups tend to use the independent self, whereas women and people from ethnic minority groups tend to use the interdependent self. So there is a natural maybe tendency, obviously that's a generalization, but there are characteristics which we all have that might make us more likely to use one or the other. But also in academia, I think it's to do with how we reward things. Because if you look at promotions criteria, are you single author or are you primary author on the paper? Have you brought in grants? So when you're doing your PhD viva, you're trained. I did this piece of research. I was the key person. I was the core. I came up with the ideas. So we're very much trained to show our contribution, because otherwise we can't move up the ladder and get tenure and get those jobs and the roles that we want. And so I think maybe when we're used to this sort of approach, and then we step into co-creative work, even if we know that it's something we want to do. We've been working so long in this environment where you're trying to, show that your ideas are valid and that this is the way we should be doing things, to really step back and to be the learner again, to go back to that, tell me your experience, or how is this going to work in your community? Or, as academics, I'll give you an example. In Stoke Reeds, myself and my PhD student, Nick Garnett, so this was co-funded between the university and our partner, Stoke Reeds. So we came up with this idea that we wanted to design this toolkit for children to encourage them to think about intelligence as something you can grow. And so we had this idea that we were going to design this toolkit, and it would have lesson plans, and the teachers would just be able to pick it up, and it would work beautifully, and it would be easy. And then we had this kind of meeting. It was our very first meeting, and we suggested this. And people weren't very sure about it. And then as we built these relationships, it kind of came through that if we'd done that, it would have been a terrible idea. And the teachers really didn't like it, because they said, well, first of all, we're the teachers. You don't know what it's like to teach 5-year-old children, which of course we don't. We weren't meaning it in that way, but it maybe came across a little bit, that we had this idea and we didn't really understand the context. but also in the UK, the national curriculum changes quite regularly. So had we tied it into lesson plans, you know, it might have been obsolete already. So that was why we changed our idea entirely from this kind of, you know, lesson plans that people could pick up to something that's a much more generic, here's the ideas and here's some things you could do, but the way you apply them in your classroom, you're the expert. So we really changed how we talked about it. And I think we could only do that because we had a trusting relationship and we really listened and tried to understand that context that the teachers themselves were working in. So to go back to the original question, I know I talked quite a bit there. I think it is to do with the way we're trained as academics, and the way we're recognized as academics. So, you know, co-creative research is slow. It takes time to build those relationships, and you need to give that time. You can't just walk in and be like, right, lesson plans, okay, done, and then send them for someone to review. You know, it takes time to have those meetings, to feedback, to discuss, to create that safe space. And I think it's something that's very worthwhile, but it does require a kind of conscious process of thinking, of building relationships.
You know, when I read your piece and thinking about this, because you know there's more. I think you're quite. If I remember the article, you're kind of explicit about the importance of. I think you called, or maybe it was my own memory of the need for a mutual passion for creating these spaces of trust that you kind of can't instrumentalize them. That I pulled out of your article, and then me thinking about my past action research practice, and I don't know, I guess I kind of had some new insights about my own practice, about how I've almost certainly kind of shortcut that trust building process. It's like, all right, we had that workshop and we had that conversation, now we can move on. And I mean, I think you really kind of interrogate that approach in the article. I mean, would you agree?
Definitely. I think we all do that sometimes. We're all very busy. We know that, you know, our partner organizations are very busy as well. They don't have time for lengthy, you know, days long, you know, over periods of time, workshops. And we as academics, you know, it's like, oh, well, you've been working on this for a while. Where's the paper? Where's the evidence of the work that we can utilize? So I think it is really important to take the time to give the space to do that, because I sometimes see things that are called co-creative, and when you really drill down into what happened, there was maybe the academics wrote something and then sent it for a review, and then people said, yeah, that looks fine, and then they say it's co-creative, but in that way it's not really, because co-creation is from that very first stage. So do you even want it to be a booklet? Would you rather have a video? You know, what are the topics that matter to you? What matters to me? And it's that way you really are engaging with each other, and that's where the exciting things happen.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, the example you just brought up, because what just sparked in my head was, in that example, which is not the way we would like to really co-create. What I just heard you say is, in effect, what happens in that example is you have one independent self and another independent self who's the part, and they're both acting as independent selves in the very act of like coming to agreement about something. Am I getting that?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Whereas if people really are interdependent, they're listening, they're trying to understand. So when you're working with your practice partner, you'd be trying to understand what their needs are, what their challenges are, what, you know, what they really want from something. And also they're trying to understand you, because, you know, we're looking for maybe different things. We're looking for a large sample size and, you know, controlled, you know, experiments and things. And so really, you know, where you can build that trust, where people are really able to be open and say, that's a terrible idea. That's what you really want, is to have created a space to do that. And to do that, you need to speak about it beforehand. You can't just walk into the room and be like, right, we're a safe space now. So it's important to think about, where are you going to hold your meetings? You know, what would a safe space look like for different people? And I think that's something that we're really keen, you know, to bring across in the paper. It's not something you do last minute. You know, it is something that you think about, that you're consciously aware of, and that you build through time, as well as the relationship is growing and changing. It's constantly looking at it and going, right, well, how can I be more interdependent? How can I be attending to my partner's, you know, needs and requirements, and how can they be attending to me?
So I'm interested, you know, it's around this idea of the interdependent self. It strikes me, I think back to my own like PhD training that was not really focused on action research, but the whole PhD work was actually all action research, if you will. And some of the, like, sort of what one might call kind of the invocations or the norms, what's the word, or the criteria for what is an interdependent self. I can hear a lot of slogans in my head that refer to that. But I'm wondering, in terms of, you know, training for academic researchers, are there ways to build the skills to be interdependent? You know, that go beyond kind of slogans and you know, do this, be interdependent, listen to other people. I mean, is there actually any kind of, I don't know, personal development one can do on this?
Well, I mean, I would hope so. We have a lot of leadership development programs, and a lot of those are, here's how to be independent, here's how to get people to listen to you, here's how to get people on your side, here's how to, you know, I think most people have been to something like that at some point in their academic training. I know I've been to a few. And so that's something that we do bring up in the paper is, you know, instead of it being, this is what we train people to do, can we train them to be interdependent? I think the answer is yes, but what that is will be different in different groups. And so it's training, you know, people being able to listen, people being empathic, people being able, you know, just aware of the, you know, the groups that they're working with, you know. So I think, you know, Deb does some really wonderful work with Indigenous First Nations people in Canada. And so she does a lot of work before she just rocks into the community and is like, we want to collect data with you. You know, she meets with the elders, and there's a lot of relationship building and understanding and mutual kind of trust building before the research even goes anywhere. There is, you know, quite a long process in that. And so I think there are things that we can do. It's something that I'd be interested in exploring more about, how we develop these skills in our grad students as well as in ourselves, because it's not it's not a recipe book, you know, it will be different. The same way leadership is different. You know, if you lead certain groups of people, you maybe are a bit more autocratic. This is what's happening. With other groups, you might have to do it a different way. So I think it's maybe a toolbox in the same way that leadership is, that people can think about different ways of engaging with others and creating these safe spaces.
That's great. Hey, thank you so much for finding the time to chat with me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, as I said, I was just, it's rare for me when I review articles that I get so engaged. I mean, in terms of, this article has something for me. This really speaks to me. And so I want to thank you and all your colleagues that were part of the article.
Thank you so much. It's been really nice talking to you.
All right, thank you all. I'm going to